What I'd like to do next is to shift gears a little bit and to start looking at what we know about how the human brain implements these visual processes. Now, first of all, you should know that the human brain seems to be divided, particularly with respect to sensory processing, into areas that are devoted to different kinds of processing. Specifically, as we're going to see shortly, different parts, in the case of the so-called visual hierarchy, different parts of the brain seem to respond preferentially to different aspects of the visual world. In fact, some parts of our brain are so tightly linked to that particular aspect of the visual world that if we were to lose that part of the brain, we'd actually lose the ability to represent and understand that aspect. And I'll show what I mean just a few slides from now. You should know that the visual system appears to be largely hierarchical. What we mean by hierarchical is that input comes in through the retina, and then visual information gets processed more and more, and gets processed for different features at each step. As we're going to see, really the retina is pretty much a detector of whether, if you were to divide the visual field in front of you into a really large number of small pixels, whether there is something or not in each of these pixels. So it's detecting, as you see in the graphic here, spots of light. Then these spots of light get organized further up in the hierarchy, really in occipital cortex. I will show that in just a moment. And there, if there are a number of spots in a row, then the visual cortex infers that there probably is a line or an edge. And then you can go further up in this hierarchy. And now if you see a number of edges together, perhaps two edges, let's say at 90 degrees, then that's a corner. And if you have four of these, you get a square or a rectangle, et cetera, et cetera. So this is how the visual brain seems to reconstruct what is out there. We start, all we have is spots of light that are hitting our retina. And from there, we have to rebuild and reconstruct what these spots of light mean and how they organize cognitively by using the processes that we saw before. And now I just want to look at what is the neural counterpart of these processes. As said in your book and on this slide, one interesting aspect of this is that the further up we go, so the later we are in this visual hierarchy, the more specialized or the more complex the type of stimulus that cortex cares about tends to be. Now here is a depiction of the lateral view of the brain. If you're not familiar with views of the brain, here you're looking at the left surface of the brain. The front of the brain would be here where my mouse is, and the back of the brain is back here where my mouse is right now. It turns out that for the most part, visual processes tend to be clustered towards the back of the brain, in the lobe generally referred to as occipital cortex. That lobe tends to overlap more or less with the yellow in this image. Now, the yellow section of the brain here, we also refer to it typically as visual cortex. Now, in here, neurons in this part of cortex tend to be particularly interested and tend to respond to the presence of lines, edges, sometimes moving lines with different degrees of complexity. So this early part of our cortex is particularly important for detecting where objects start and where objects end. In here, some cells also respond to things such as movement, and some cells also respond to features such as color. This is often also referred to as early visual cortex. You might see in these slides or in any other text that you read about neuroscience, you might hear this area referred to as V1, V2, V3, which are subsections of this area. For clarification, I'm never going to ask you about these acronyms in a quiz, but knowing the acronyms might just help you remember the context in which some question is asked. Now, in here, as I was saying, these so-called low-level features tend to be detected. And I will show you an example of that. Then the information from here gets passed forward and progresses towards neurons and areas within the temporal cortex, which is all this section right here of the brain is known as temporal cortex. Now, the inferior part of temporal cortex is particularly important for object recognition. The point that we often refer to this stream of processing inside the brain as the what stream, in the sense that this part of the brain is particularly important for determining the identity of what you're looking at. So in here, you're going to find areas that respond to color, that respond to objects, and to specific kinds of objects, such as faces or places. You might hear different areas in here referred to as V4, as a color center, the LOC, the lateral occipital complex, the FFA, the face fusiform area, and we're going to talk about some of these. But again, information from early visual cortex progresses down the so-called what stream, and here the neurons respond to the identity, either to features such as color or the identity of what you're looking at. Now, the information from early visual cortex also gets moved, some part of it gets processed in the parietal lobe, which are up here. The parietal lobe doesn't seem to respond much to the identity of something, but seems rather to be interested into two main features, which is why we refer to this stream of processing as both the where and the how. So excuse me, the where and the how ways. Now, neurons up here seem to be interested in particular in things such as motion, position in space, and the interface of visual processing and motor action. So when I say that there's the where pathway, these are neurons that are interested in position in space and motion. The how pathway is interested in how, once you're seeing something, how do you interact with it? For example, up here in the interpretal sulcus, there are neurons that respond specifically to how you need to open your fingers to grip something. So this part of the brain is at the interface between processing visual information and producing behavior.